So we have now a time for all ages. So if there are any young people joining us this morning, you are especially invited to come join us on the screen, and also anyone who is young in spirit. It is truly a time for all ages. This is the story of a lost three-toed sloth. There once was a girl named Laura who lived with her family and all of her animals in the kingdom of Lauritania. It was named after its founder, Queen Laura, the ancestor of the present Laura, who is the subject of our story. Laura, as I mentioned, had many animals who lived with her in the palace. There was Terry the echidna, Mo the moa, Bob the blobfish, Mildred the Sasquatch. There was also an iguanodon named Izzy, and the latest addition of all was named Earl. He was a three-toed sloth. Laura's life with her animals was basically perfect. Every morning she would go on long walks with them all, sampling of the exotic nectars and fruits that grew in the royal garden. She had just one problem: her parents. They didn't think it was proper for future royalty to consort with these kinds of animals, and adding a three-toed sloth to the mix was a bridge too far. You know, they said, there are all kinds of normal animals that you could want for a pet. There are dogs and cats, there are turtles and fish. You've been to our stables, we have rows of horses. You could have any one of them you choose. It was true. Laura's parents owned the biggest stable of horses in all the kingdom. Don't you want one? Laura's parents asked her. Laura shook her head no, she didn't want one of the horses. Why not? Bristled her father. Are you saying they aren't perfect? That they aren't the best horses of them all? Where, I ask, have you ever seen one better? Nowhere, said Laura. They are the best horses. That's why I don't want one. Laura's parents looked at each other and sighed. There was simply no reasoning with her. Their daughter, the future queen, was going to continue to stroll around the palace grounds, eating those flowers they kept telling her not to touch, surrounded by all these strange animals, several of whom were known to be extinct or even imaginary. All the while, she continued to attract whispers and mutterings from the people of Lauritania. What is she doing? They said. With all the horses her family owns to choose from, this is how she spends her time? She must be a strange girl indeed. Till one day, when the people came back again to stare at the palace walk, Laura was gone. She and her animals were nowhere in sight. All the neighbors could hear was a small plaintive wailing from the chambers of the future queen. Laura's parents and her various ministers and retainers gathered outside the chamber door. What's wrong? Asked her father. Why are you crying? Earl is gone, Laura sobbed. I can't find him anywhere. He must have gotten lost. Oh, said Laura's father flatly. I see. Well, I'm sure he'll turn up. No, Dad, Laura cried. I looked everywhere. He's lost. Laura's father's heart was torn. He turned to Laura's various ministers and retainers and scratched his head in puzzlement. What should I do? He asked them. Time heals all wounds, said one of the retainers, flapping his arms complacently. What if she never forgives me? Asked Laura's father. Oh, don't worry, said the chief minister. It will pass. She'll have forgotten about that sloth by tomorrow morning. Laura's father, you see, had done a bad thing. He hadn't meant any harm by it. But he was tired of seeing those people come and stare at his daughter's weird, extinct, and possibly fictitious animals while she strolled the palace grounds. This was no way to get a start in life. Especially if she was to be queen one day, she would have to be seen as somebody who made good decisions in all things, including the company she kept. Therefore, Laura's father decided it would only be right to find that three-toed sloth a new home. So one day, while the animals were out for a walk with Laura, one of the palace guards snuck up behind them and snatched Earl away. He delivered the struggling sloth to Laura's father, who took him outside by the back door of the palace. Setting the sloth down into a royal receptacle on the palace's driveway, he said, "Goodbye, Earl, you're free now." And he turned his back on Earl in the royal receptacle and walked back inside, closing the door behind him. Now, however, Laura's father felt a twinge of guilt. He could see how attached his daughter had been to that sloth. Maybe he had made the wrong decision. On the other hand, Laura's ministers and retainers, who happened to also be her siblings, told him not to worry. She'll get over it, they kept insisting. And now that she doesn't have that sloth, she can have any animal she wants. Laura's father saw that this was indeed a silver lining, so he hastened to go cheer up Laura with this idea. He knocked on her door again. "Laura, are you in there?" The wordless sobbing was the only noise he heard. Her father turned the handle on the chamber door. "Laura," he said, peering in. He saw that his daughter was lying on the ground, her eyes red. She uttered a wordless groan of despair. "So," said Laura's father, pacing around the room, "I can see you're upset about losing that sloth. Who wouldn't be? I mean, sure, he's a strange animal. You've got loads of those weird stuffed animals and imaginary friends that you're always talking about. A lot of girls would have liked to have a dog or a cat or a parrot or one of my great horses. And you could have one of those horses anytime you wish. All you need to do is to say the word." "Dad, try to understand," said Laura between sighs and tears. "Have you ever lost something that you loved? Has one of your horses ever gone missing?" Laura's father stopped pacing. His daughter's words had reminded him of something painful. "Yes," he recalled. "One time, one of the horses wandered away. I searched for it for hours. And when that horse went away," Laura went on, "did it matter to you that you had plenty of other horses? Were you like, oh, who cares? What's one horse, more or less?" "No," said Laura's father with dawning horror. "I wasn't." "Were you even thinking about any of those other horses?" "No, I wasn't," said Laura's father. "All I could think of was the one that went missing. Whether it was cold and wet, whether it was lonesome and lost, whether it needed me and wanted to get home." "Well, exactly," Laura finished, getting ready to cry again. "That's how I feel about Earl." Laura's father's heart was suddenly racing. "Good Lord," he said, "I made a terrible mistake." "What?" "Oh, nothing. It's just, I didn't realize quite how much that sloth meant to you. I'll go find him. I swear, I'll leave no stone unturned." And Laura's father raced out of her room and down the hall, banging open the back door, and started the engine of the royal chariot. He roared out of the garage and made a fast turn into the street. He saw that he was very nearly too late. A horde of mounted brigands was absconding with the royal receptacle in which Earl had last been seen, which the brigands came to collect every week on Monday morning. Laura's father was gunning the motor on the royal chariot to try to catch up with them when suddenly he heard his daughter's voice behind him. "Dad," Laura cried, "watch out, it's Earl." Laura's father slammed on the brakes and got out of the car. Laura was right. The stuffed three-toed sloth was there, right in front of the stopped vehicle. "Oh," said Laura's father, supposing the sloth had fallen out of the garbage can as it was being collected. "I guess he didn't actually get that far." "Of course he didn't," said Laura, scooping him up. "He's a sloth." And from that day forward, Earl was always at Laura's side. And Laura's father became Earl's biggest admirer inside the house, always making sure he had a spot at the table and could join the family on their walks around the palace grounds.
Here you go.
He never bothered Laura again about getting a dog or a parrot or a horse. "They may be the best horses to me," he said, "because they need me. And Earl is the best three-toed sloth for Laura because he needs her. And that makes him the best that could be."
For all ages.
The end.
I know.
Yeah.
Put him to bed and sleep. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Now that was lovely. I'm glad that the sloth was found.
Johnson is gonna.
Thank you. I miss playing organ at the church, so I changed the instrument.
Thank you, Drew. That was beautiful and perfect. The service. So I wanted to share a brief reading now before our meditation. So as folks may have noticed, the title for today's service overall comes from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address to the nation, at which he said the famous words, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." This was in a call at the time for national healing and reconciliation in the wake of the US Civil War. However, Lincoln in this speech did not just speak of reconciliation, because he was also convinced of the need for permanently stamping out and eliminating the evils of slavery as an institution. And so therefore he says in this address that charity must always be tempered with a spirit of firmness in the right. So for our reading today, I wanted to share a poem by Edgar Lee Masters. It comes from his collection, The Spoon River Anthology. And it's written from the perspective of a woman named Anne Rutledge, who is purported to be the first person whom Abraham Lincoln ever loved earlier in his life before he met Mary Todd. I'm going to read the poem and then invite us to into a space of meditation. Out of me, unworthy and unknown, the vibrations of deathless music, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Out of me, the forgiveness of millions toward millions, and the beneficent face of a nation shining with justice and truth. I am Anne Rutledge, who sleep beneath these weeds, beloved in life of Abraham Lincoln, wedded to him not through union, but through separation. Bloom forever, O Republic, from the dust of my bones. I invite you all to join me in a moment of meditation about these words and to think about the role that forgiveness and charity and justice and accountability play in our lives, and how you find ways to strike the balance between the two. Thank you for joining me in that moment of silence. And now our second hymn in the service is going to be "Break Not the Circle."
Break not
Thank you again, Joa and Suzanne, for that lovely music. Our sermon is called With Malice Toward None. This is a sermon I wasn't sure I'd ever get to deliver. When I first found out that I had been asked to preach in late February, I of course wasn't sure right away what I wanted to say. This was back in October. But after the week of November 3rd, the idea I wanted to convey in this sermon began to congeal in my brain. The election results were in. We were going to have a different president and new administration after 4 difficult years. And by the time February 28th rolled around, I knew that this fact would be well established. I therefore thought the timing would be perfect for a retrospective look at the very difficult period we had just passed through as a nation, and that I would conclude with a needed plea for healing and reconciliation. My sermon on this theme was all mapped out in my head, and I just needed to wait. Weeks passed, however, and it began to become clear for me that it was not going to be so simple. The election results, no matter how many times they were independently confirmed, were going to be fought every step of the way. Here I was prepared to urge us to forgive and extend the olive branch, yet partisan warfare was still raging all around us. It felt a little presumptuous to start speaking about extending mercy when the battle was still in progress. On the other hand, I kept telling myself that I had until February 28th for all of this to sort itself out. Surely by then the former president would concede, the new one would take the oath of office, and we could start discussing the terms of the peace. More weeks went by. This conviction started to waver. By the time we got to the events of January 6th, when a mob stormed the Capitol to interrupt the tabulation of the votes, I'd given up this sermon for dead. I was not sure that our system of government was going to be here for the next few days, let alone all the way until February 28th, let alone in such an intact form that we could graciously look back on recent experience and say, now, of course, we see that everything has resolved itself and we are ready to forgive. Of course, I recognize that the idea that democracy might have died on January 6th sounds exaggerated. It sounds that way to me right now in saying it. Yet we also have to ask ourselves, when have we seen something like this before? What is our standard of comparison? I've certainly never lived through anything like it before. February 28th suddenly felt to me like it would never come, or if it did, that the country might not be the same anymore to greet it. That our Constitution and way of life might not be there to greet it. Yet February 28th did come, and we're here. Our institutions are still here too, still flawed, still deeply imperfect, still riven by injustice and partisan division, but still here in spite of the odds. And so I guess I do have a chance to give my sermon, the one I planned out in my head those months ago. But the question is, do I still feel like giving it? Do I want to talk about forgiveness and reconciliation after all we've been through in recent history? The answer is that I do. I don't think I'd be in the right pulpit if I felt otherwise, but I think I owe some explanation as to what I mean by that in the wake of these last months and these last 4 years. Before I turn to that, I should also say a word about why this matters to me, not just politically, but personally as well. Now, I know that this is a congregation, it is a non-partisan space, and whatever our own views, we check party affiliations at the door. You can also probably infer from the place where I work and some other key facts about me which way I tend to cast my vote in the ballot box. However, I also know that you don't have to be a Democrat or a Republican or anything else to feel very troubled by the direction this country has taken these last few years. For me, the summer and fall of 2015 were a turning point in my life and in my political awareness. I don't want to imply that this was the first time I paid attention to a presidential election or a presidential primary. I'd cared about electoral politics for a long time, but I felt a qualitatively different sort of alarm about Donald Trump's bid for the presidency. The disturbance I felt at this prospect had nothing to do with the party to which Trump belonged. It was the actions he undertook and the words he used, the contempt he consistently showed for the rights of others. Different people had different moments during Trump's candidacy when they felt for the first time that here was something different in American politics, that something had gone very wrong. For some, it was Trump's comments about women. For others, it was his remarks on the campaign trail about Mexican immigrants or his mockery of a journalist with a disability. In my case, while all these incidents made a strong and disturbing impression, none shook me quite so deeply as Trump's statement published on his official campaign page, calling for a, quote, total shutdown on Muslims coming into this country. This moment was the bright dividing line for me. We had crossed from partisan disagreement into a totally different plane. Throughout my life, I'd never heard a US president make this kind of statement before. To be sure, our government has been guilty of all kinds of racism and wrongdoing before. I don't mean to deny that. Still, every president in my lifetime had paid lip service, at least, to the idea that they intended to be the president for all Americans of whatever religion or race. The fact that Trump would openly state the opposite showed me that he presented an altogether new kind of threat to our democratic order. This seemed obvious to me, but more than that, I assumed it would be obvious to others as well, including Republicans. This belief, while it may sound naive, was not grounded in inexperience. I grew up in Texas and Florida, after all. I went to an Episcopalian high school. I have known plenty of Republicans. My family, in fact, is full of Republicans, past and present, and at the risk of descending into a cliche that in my case actually happens to be true, some of my best friends are Republicans. My attitude toward the Republican Party was fundamentally one that invited coexistence and even collaboration. We might have our differences, I thought, but none of us thought that racism was okay, right? None of us thought that banning people or derogating people because of their religion or nationality was okay. None of us thought that misogyny and sexist abuse were okay. I figured in the form of Trump's primary bid for the GOP nomination, we were looking at the rise of a demagogue who had no place in any democratic society, and that both the right and left-wing parties that believed in democracy would have no trouble recognizing this. How wrong I was, we may be thinking at this point. But we have to cast our minds back to that fall of 2015 and realize that this was not obvious at the time. My aforementioned Republican friend, for instance, my best friend in high school and for many years since, he told me every other week during that period that he, quote, did not like Trump and did not plan to vote for him. Nor was he atypical. There was a flourishing, quote, never Trump movement at the time among conservatives. There were many Republicans for whom it was clear Trump did not represent their values. After Trump won the primary and then the 2016 election, however, I began to see a change in my friend, one that was paralleled, I'm sorry to say, by the conservative movement more broadly. It was not like a switch being turned. It was more gradual than that. My friend chose to sit out the voting process on election night 2016, and he never turned around later on and told me outright that he had become a Trump supporter. But he started trying to convince me that Trump was, if not an ideal candidate, at least fundamentally normal and not to be feared. You know, I've realized something, he would tell me, his voice laden with pseudo-profundity. There are all these elections every 4 years and everyone gets all riled up, but then regardless of who actually wins, nothing ever changes. Maybe not for you, I said. We were, by this time in the spring of 2017, I was only months into a job at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, working mostly on programs related to the US refugee program, which Trump had already put on total hold in his first week in office. My friend, a white male Floridian like me, was not a Syrian refugee. He was not a Central American asylum seeker. I tried to confront him with the possibility that the mere fact that he did not see the concrete effects of politics in his own life did not mean these effects weren't real for others. I got, I'm sorry to say, a little bit red in the face and angry in the midst of this speech. My friend was perturbed. To my immense surprise, he didn't really argue with me. Well, I'm not a racist, he said. I don't have anything against asylum seekers or refugees or Muslims. Well, okay, I replied, I never disputed it, but then why are you defending a politician who is against all of these groups of people? My friend just looked confused. Look, I know this issue is important to you, he said. I can see you're really passionate about it. It's just not really my issue. This little interchange from 2017, which seemed so odd to me at the time, has become a kind of template ever since for how I see people respond to Trump. I would have thought it was just a quirk on my friend's part if I didn't see Senate Republicans deploying the same tactic every other week. Maddeningly, no one ever seemed to actually defend Trump in the moment because so much of what he said was indefensible. Instead, they would simply change the subject when he came up and then look at you like you must be feeling unwell. The apt and trending term for this strategy is called gaslighting. My friend deployed it on me plenty of times, just as senior Republican members of Congress would use it on journalists. Trump would tweet out that he might, quote, delay the election, unquote. Journalists would ask Republican senators about this. Oh, I didn't see that tweet, the senators would say. Stop overreacting and getting so emotional. As if the journalists were the ones who had gone off the deep end. After encountering this behavior for years, after witnessing time and again how people who ought to know better would choose at the crucial moment not to hold Trump accountable, not to stand up for his bad behavior, it is understandable that a certain amount of cynicism took root on the left in response. Many simply ran out of patience. I would tell my leftist friends about how I could simply no longer have a reasonable conversation with my Republican friend, how he would gaslight me and tell me I was suffering from the usual liberal, quote, Trump derangement syndrome, end quote. And yet I would find I got no sympathy from my leftist friends either. He sounds awful, they would say. Get rid of him. Why are you spending time with a person like that? After seeing Republicans fail to stand up to Trump, as was confirmed most recently, of course, in his second acquittal in the Senate for his second impeachment in the House, many people began to say that Republicans were just not worth troubling about. They were a lost cause. A New York Times editorial ran in November 2020 that articulated this thought most succinctly. The headline ran, quote, reach out to Trump supporters, they said. I tried. The author goes on to conclude, quote, believe me, the effort is not worth it. I can sympathize, to be sure, with the sentiment. I have felt it myself many times before. Ultimately, however, I believe that this is wrong, and this for several reasons. The first reason is that Trump supporters are still here. They don't go away simply for being dismissed. And so long as we live in a shared democracy, they continue to have a say in our collective future. We therefore have to find some way of speaking to each other. This is a timeless truth that does not change in form across the generations. As Saul Alinsky once put it, writing about conservative voters, the silent majority of his era, quote, to reject them is to lose them by default. They will not shrivel and disappear. You can't switch channels and get rid of them. This is what you've been doing in your radicalized dream world, but they are here and will be. And if we don't win them, Wallace or Spiro T. Nixon will, end quote. This is what we might call the pragmatic reason for continuing to reach out across the yawning political divide. But there is also, I believe, a moral and spiritual reason to do so. And that is that people, even when they disappoint us, even when they fail us, are nonetheless also capable of surprising us. This is why we have to keep faith in humankind, not because it is justified in every instance, but because it is in some, and we never know which it is going to be in advance. For every person who lets us down, who fails to live up to what we had hoped, There is another of whom we had long since despaired, had written off years ago, who suddenly and unexpectedly becomes a more serious person. I told you how my friend, after Trump's election in 2016, started to undergo a gradual change. I do not deny it for an instant. Yet I add that starting in the summer of 2020, he started to change yet again. Just like the first time, it was not dramatic. There was no conversion. He didn't announce to me some bold revolutionary change in his patterns of thought. Yet I noticed him doing things he would not have done before. After the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police, he posted for the first time on his social media the words, "Black Lives Matter." As the coronavirus raged across the country and he, like so many of us, was suddenly confined at home, his whole life turned upside down, he wondered aloud to me, how did wearing a mask become a political issue? What could be more basic? After the presidential debates last fall, he called me in a state of emotional turmoil. What had particularly upset him were the moments in these debates when Trump had been asked point blank to do something simple, to condemn the Proud Boys movement and the QAnon conspiracy theory, and Trump had failed to do so. How hard would that have been? My friend asked. Why can't he answer this simple question? In every case, I bit my tongue. I did not tell him I told you so. I did not say that he might not have been surprised if he had been paying more attention to what Trump had said and done before. Instead, I just listened and inwardly rejoiced. The process culminated on election night, November 2020. My friend texted to tell me that he had stayed home. I don't like either of them, he said. I'm not going to vote this year at all. And so help me, seeing as he was a lifelong conservative in a swing state, that was good enough for me. I went to tell my leftist friends the good news. I was overjoyed. My Republican, occasionally Trump-supporting friend is not voting, I told them. Once again, however, they were unimpressed. My friend's actions wrung from them no sympathy. How could he just not vote? They roared. How was the choice in this election not completely obvious to him? He said Black Lives Matter on Twitter, I said. He was horrified by the Proud Boys comment. He's changing. They replied that this should be the bare minimum. It's what we should expect of any decent person, not something to celebrate. There is a phrase on the left that speaks to this attitude. It's called the ally cookie. The idea is that white people do one good thing and then instantly expect to be showered with praise for it. Handed a cookie, in other words, just for being an ally, when really being an ally to racial justice is the least that any white person can do. In reality, my leftist friend said, my Republican friend should not expect any special congratulations just for refraining from voting for someone they regarded as a racist demagogue. He does not deserve to be celebrated and coddled just for staying home and not going out to inflict damage on the rights of his fellow Americans. It could have been worse, they are willing to grant. They were glad my friend had started to see the light. But really, he should have seen through Trump's con years before, they said. Why was he upset about Trump's Proud Boys comments, but he hadn't felt the same way when Trump said the same thing about neo-Nazis in Charlottesville years earlier? My friend should be condemned, not praised, for being so late to this crucial realization. Once again, I understand their attitude perfectly well. And once again, however, I think it is wrong. What comes to mind for me is not only our universalist heritage, but more specifically, the gospel parable of the lost sheep. Jesus in this parable is speaking to an audience much like my leftist friends. Why are you interacting with tax collectors and sinners? They ask him. Why are you wasting your time on people who are no good? Much like our New York Times author, they urged him not to bother those people they say are beyond saving. Jesus replies with the following story, quote, "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he cries to his friends and neighbors and says, 'Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep.' I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who never needed to repent." End quote. In other words, a person may be doing only the bare minimum. They may be doing far less than others. They may only be making just the first tentative steps towards a fuller understanding of social injustice and racial injustice and the role they should play in confronting it. And Jesus is saying for that very reason, those tentative steps should be celebrated the most. Those who never needed to be told differently, those who were already part of anti-racist movements, sure, we celebrate them, but they were never lost sheep to start with. It's those whom we see making first strides whom we should lift up for praise. Jesus would clearly be in favor, in short, of giving out an ally cookie. And the parable of the lost sheep is nothing other than the ultimate defense of the ally cookie. This does not mean that we should not seek accountability for injustice. This does not mean that we should fail to hold our friends and our fellow Americans to a high standard. But it does mean that we recognize and celebrate the small things along the way, the baby steps. If we don't, no one will be encouraged to ever take bigger steps beyond that. We have to see and reward the reminders of the shared humanity in others, no matter how buried these may be. We should celebrate the small, faint rays of human goodness, not because these are enough, but because we are aware of how deeply obscured these things often are in ourselves as well. How great are the temptations to complacency and moral apathy, and how many times we've fallen to these temptations ourselves. It is in this spirit that we can seek to revive and make good on Abraham Lincoln's words from his second inaugural address, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." Neither for us nor for Lincoln did these words mean that we should not seek justice. In that same speech, let us recall, Lincoln spoke of the terrible necessity of a war to cleanse the nation of the moral stain of slavery. But Lincoln concluded, firmness in the right could and must go hand in hand with charity toward one's neighbors and forgiveness for the frailty in others, of which we might ourselves have been guilty had we been in their shoes. By doing so, we may yet as a nation live to merit those prayerful wishes of Anne Rutledge, which we heard earlier in our service in the voice of Edgar Lee Masters' poem. Quote, "Out of me, unknown and unworthy, the vibrations of deathless music, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Out of me, the forgiveness of millions toward millions, and the beneficent face of a nation, shining with justice and truth. Bloom forever, O Republic, from the dust of my bones." May it be so.
Oh, thank you. Wow. Wow.
Thank you again, Jua and Suzanne. It's really lovely. Our closing words for our benediction come from Vivian Pomeroy. This is reading 477 in the hymnal. Forgive us that often we forgive ourselves so easily and others so hardly. Forgive us that we expect perfection from those to whom we show none. Forgive us for repelling people by the way we set a good example. Forgive us the folly of trying to improve a friend. Forbid that we should use our little idea of goodness as a spear to wound those who are different. Forbid that we should feel superior to others when we are only more shielded. And may we encourage the secret struggle of every person. Let it be so.
Thank you. That was wonderful.